Hello and welcome everybody to our Earthster webinar, part of our summit series about industry associations leading LCA adoptions. And today we have a great panel. So we have three great panelists to discuss about this topic and how industry associations can lead LCA adoption, can make people wiser about the sustainability of their products and services. Today we have with us John Mooney, senior fellow at the Advanced Leadership Initiative in Harvard. He's focused on strategic corporate engagement and adoption of environmental, social, and governance principles. And he also brings his experience after having been a CFO for 15 years, responsible for strategy and having a sustainability team reporting to him. We also have Steve Kooy, Director of Health and Sustainability at BIFMA, the Trade Association for Business and Institutional Furniture Manufacturers. And we have Greg Norris, co-founder at Earthster and very experienced LCA practitioner teaching LCA in Harvard and MIT. So welcome, everybody, to the panel. Let's start with Steve and John. You both have experience both in industry associations as well as in business. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience? Let's start, for example, with Steve.
Sure. Thanks, Daniel, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Appreciate the time. So my experience starts almost, 20 plus years ago. It started in the manufacturing world of office furniture. In back then, it was all about compliance. As we moved forward as a society, sustainability became the buzzword, and my job, in part, along with a great team, was to bring that word into more of a strategy within the corporation. So I spent about 15, 16 years working for manufacturing, primarily Hayworth, which is one of the larger office furniture companies in the world. And then I moved into certification and testing. So I worked for Intertech and SCS. So it gave me a little bit of a different perspective, right? I went from being on the manufacturing side to being on the side of certifying products and helping people with EPDs and LCAs and things like that. So then obviously most recently, I took both of those backgrounds and went to the trade association, hopefully help all of the manufacturers in the commercial office space.
Yeah, Steve, I'll take over from there and just give you a little background. So as Daniel said, I was a CFO and had strategy and sustainability that I worked with for a long time. I started my career at Motorola, and so I was in multiple industries, consumer electronics, semiconductors, automotive electronics, kind of worked all over the world and had a great experience. And I became a CFO in 2005. And maybe I'll just tell a quick story of how I even got connected to the sustainability side and how it also maybe connects to what we're going to talk about here. So when I first started at Hayworth, the company I worked at, they were going to redo their headquarters. They were going to tear it down to the ground, and they were going to rebuild it. And we were looking at a lot of different things as a company. And I just started, so I didn't really know. But first thing we looked at was geothermal heat. And my finance team got involved, and we did a bunch of math and worked with the sustainability team and some folks you might know. And we came up with the math, and it was about a 17-year payback. So me, as the finance guy, I said, well, we're not going forward with geothermal heat. So we didn't do geothermal heat. And there were a lot of complexities to it and lack of understanding of future technologies, et cetera, that influenced the decision. But as the finance guys had 7-year payback, not going to do that. Shortly after that, we decided we were taking a look at doing a green roof. And we had a headquarters that had a part of the building that went down to the ground, kind of like a pie shape. And so we did all the math on that, and it came back to be about a 15-year payback. So I walk into the owner of the company and the CEO, and I say, we're not going to do that either, 15-year payback. That's not going to work financially. And the owner of the company and the CEO kind of patted me on the head and said, that's nice, but we're actually doing the green roof because every day when people drive into the company, they'll drive up and see that green roof. And we're trying to inspire the whole company to be able to be more sustainable and to think about that and everything they do that day. So to me, that was right away, I knew I had to control the budgets of the sustainability team because they were going to be out of control. But I think that's the great trade-off that you run into all the time that we can talk about here today is how do you really make progress? How do you actually balance the financial needs where there's a guy like me sitting there trying to stop progress sometimes, if you want to think of it that way, connected with passionate people on the sustainability side that recognize the value of the things that go far beyond what the financial numbers tell you, and then connected to a leadership team or an owner or a shareholder that actually wants to do it. So I was lucky to have done that had that for many years. We went zero waste to energy globally. We eliminated a lot of hazardous materials. I became LEED certified during that just to really understand it. And and I'm now SASB certified. So I think I have a decent understanding, but we'll talk more about how connected to associations, which we relied on heavily as a company to actually provide this kind of credible, trusted source that also looked out for our industry, but also concern about customers and stakeholders. So thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, John. And Greg, you have also worked with a number of industry associations. Can you also give us a quick background?
Sure. Well, it's great to be here with these guys. I have for a long time been both an academic on LCA and a consultant, helping companies apply life cycle assessment. And I guess in my experience with the Athena Institute, for example, and also experience working on an early version of Earthster, we had the opportunity to connect with and disseminate life cycle assessment tools and receive data for an industry going into a database with the leadership of industry associations. So I've seen them as really powerful ways to tackle common problems among a group of companies. And I guess just a quick story I would tell is I've always been amazed at how collegial those meetings are. These are competitors, but that's really not the feeling you get at all. It's amazingly collaborative, sense of esprit de corps that's really very tangible.
Thank you, Greg. And before we jump into LCA itself, let's take a first look a bit more broadly. Sustainability in industry. What do you see are the key pressures or challenges? What's making companies act, and what is stopping them from acting? Who wants to take the question? You'll all get the chance.
Maybe I'll jump in on this one, Steve, if you don't mind to kick it
Sure.
off. Part of when I recently, let's call it, retired and have spent the last couple of years at Harvard trying to dig into how I can more effectively help companies to drive ESG. And I reconnected with Steve, and we worked with the association to try and do an engagement where we try to really identify all the issues in the industry, what we thought mattered, and we talked to multiple stakeholders. So I interviewed 40 different senior stakeholders between capital markets, banks, influencers like architects and designers, board of directors, C-suite individuals, sustainability practitioners throughout the industry and outside the industry. So kind of created this ecosystem to see what the sense was of what was going on. And it was really interesting to what I felt was driving sustainability. I'll have Steve add on. Obviously we're all aware of all the visibility and transparency that's happening in society. But as I'd go through each one of these organizations and have these discussions, it was just really interesting to me, all the gaps in knowledge, all the people who were driving forward, but had all these gaps in knowledge. So I would talk to banks and investors, and they would all know at a high level, they wanted to be tracking sustainability. They wanted to be understanding, obviously the risk to their investments long-term, what they thought was going to drive future profitability. But the way they came at that was a very limited level of knowledge. They would go out and look at index providers to see if they could get ratings. They would try and get information, and they didn't exactly know what to ask of the customers that they were dealing with. So if there were 5 banks in the industry, they would go to each customer, they'd all have different requirements, et cetera. And so when I would talk to them about an association, they would say to me, yeah, it would be great if an industry could consolidate around a common set of metrics that were consistent, that we could leverage, as opposed to us trying to figure out what matters for the industry, where the risks are, where the points are. And that was very consistent. I would talk to architects and designers who were very knowledgeable, but they didn't really understand what one common approach was. And they all wanted to have a competitive advantage when they talked to their customers, but that also created this crazy web of requirements that they would ask of their customers. Customers were the same way. They were dealing with multiple different suppliers, and they're trying to figure out what questions to ask, what's relevant. So there's a lot of things that are driving companies to really become more sustainable. Investor pressures, community pressures, capital providers, the reputation and risk elements. But it was just very clear how disparate the knowledge was and how much people craved an opportunity to bring it together into one common framework that they could all leverage. So Steve, maybe I'll turn it over to you to add on anything you want.
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything that John's saying there. I mean, again, spending 20 years in this, the ball keeps moving, and it's hard to find a way to really zero in on what matters. And I think that's probably the number one thing that I think the materiality we need to figure out. So to John's point, what's material, what's important within an industry. And of course, it could be different in our industry versus another one. And again, I do think trade associations can help there. People have bounced around a bit in our world, from toxic chemicals, that being the number one thing they were concerned about, to honestly now it's climate change. And that's great. And both are great in terms of we have to address both. And then, unfortunately, what seems to happen is, I'd say, a never-ending quest for data. I think that, that's great. We need data, but at the same time, the data is there to make decisions. So from my perspective, again, just building on what John's saying, we have to standardize, and we have to get into a mindset of, these are the pressures, now let's work on them. Because another one that I can throw out there that's probably extremely popular right now, and again, for good reason, is circularity. COVID has kind of proven that people are starting to see more and more product that was maybe useful 3, 4, 5 years ago, and now it's going to the curb, so to speak. And people are saying, wait a minute, this isn't good. So, again, all really good things. But if you're a manufacturer and you're in a design cycle where you're designing this product and launching it, and it's a 5-year cycle to get it to from, say, design to launch, you can't keep seeing things move. You have to have priorities and start to say, okay, these are what they are. And we all know that a lot of people on this call are LCA practitioners, and that's what the LCA is supposed to drive. So what's the study going on, and then how it's going to impact that design and supply chain. And then, sadly, we just see it move to a new priority. So that's what's hurting us, I'd say. I don't know if Greg, if you have anything to add to that.
I think you guys, I like your summary very much. I think those are two of the key themes for me too.
And Steve, you touched already what LCA drives, and I know much of our audience also is interested on that angle. So what do you see are the key challenges and opportunities that the companies are facing right now in regards to LCA, when they're requested LCA, when they are trying to make use of LCA?
So, such a good question. There's so many things there that I could get into. So let's start. I mean, again, I'll kind of start with where we were maybe 10, 15 years ago, when LCAs were just in our industry, just becoming a little more popular. For better or worse, and I think, again, there's pros and cons to this. The mindset was, LEED was out there. There were a few other certifications and whatnot where people said, I need an LCA, and therefore I need a EPD, or environmental product declaration, and I need it certified. And honestly, the feeling was, by many, it was a check the box activity. So in some ways it gets started on the wrong foot. But the good news is, people started to realize that at a practical mindset, if you did look in the LCA, you could start to get into what are the hot spots, right? Where are the issues, whether it's water, toxicity, certainly climate change, things like that. What are the materials of construction that you may want to replace? So I think there was a lot of good that came from, even if it was maybe just to check a box, it started to benefit society. The pressures that we're under now, or maybe the concerns that we see now in our industry, is people want to compare this information. Mm-hmm. Certainly, BIFMA is fortunate. We've done product category rules. We've done other things to at least get things to be a little bit more comparable, but we're still a long way from comparison. And the pressure is mounting, honestly, on a daily basis for people to, and this gets back to John's comments about the stakeholders that he interviewed, at all levels. They want to take 3 or 4 EPDs or 3 or 4 LCAs and just line them up and say, whatever has the lowest carbon footprint, that's the one to pick. And that's by all means not advisable at this time, especially with the way that the science and the calculations have worked out within our industry, but we are going to work on it. And that's the biggest thing we're going to work on in the next 1 to 5 years. And honestly, we want to work with teams like Earthster to do that. It's going to take more than just our industry to work on that. It's going to take some firepower in terms of technology and just plain expertise to start to see how we can either put a range together or some other type of system together that will allow people to see maybe a good, better, best scenario and make selections. Because that is the ultimate plan. Well, the ultimate plan originally was about design and the impact, but I think we now have to look at both how it will impact design and the mindset internally, as well as how it might impact purchases externally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me just, if you don't mind, play off exactly what Steve said, and I'll take the standpoint of being kind of the practitioner, the person that not the LCA practitioner, the business practitioner who had to make decisions based on that. So as Steve said, my experience with LCAs, as I would try and get, see teams in the company trying to work on them, is they took a long time. They were complicated. They were expensive. When I would get the readout, it was very hard to interpret it. It would be pages and pages of data. I didn't know the source. I might hear one company versus another that have different approaches to end of life. They had different approaches to beginning. So to me, there was a lack of standards. It was difficult to compare. And the thing that I think was most challenging was that once I spent all this time and money to get the LCA, it was very difficult. I had to have experts in the company that could then interpret it to be actionable, to actually make the company better because of the LCA we just did. So when Steve mentioned Earthster, and I know how I first got involved with Earthster, was the idea that it simplifies the accumulation of data into a common standard approach. But the scenario planning part of it is what's the most appealing, because that's the thing that we would struggle with. And so when we talk on this call about associations, the big advantage of an association, and as Greg mentioned earlier, is in theory, they can kind of overcome the competitive barriers. And instead of having one individual company having to figure it all out themselves and figure out how to take action, an association that looks out for its members can be the interface between a great organization like Earthster that has a lot of the tools available, but then interpret it directly for the industry in the way that's most effective for the industry. So they're kind of that intermediary that you need to bridge the gap. An individual company can do it, but sometimes you don't have the resources, the expertise. If you're a small company, it's very difficult to spend the time on it. So having an association as the intermediary that works with partners, and I'm using Earthster as an example, is what really makes a difference. Because what I want to have, and I'll oversimplify this, I want to have the potato chip label, the food label that's on a potato chip bag that tells me exactly what comes out of this, so I can compare different products, and I can take it and say, hey, if I want to cut down on my sodium intake, I'm then gonna start to do what, which is what I think, again, Earthster provides examples. So to me, the big challenge is, how do you bring all that data together? There's so much data you have to get through. There's cost, there's complexity, there aren't standards. How do you bring it together so someone like me, who may not be knowledgeable as much as a practitioner who understands the detail, can then take it and work with the business side to execute strategy to improve it, to do scenario analysis, to try and do that. And so again, that's where I think LCAs can be very powerful, but they have to be interpreted into a usable, actionable framework. And that's what I think associations can help with, and companies like Earthster are very well positioned to help with that as well.
Wow. I just can't help but emphasize maybe the key word for me in your comments, John: actionability. Turning these LCAs into a basis for change, positive change within the company that helps them. Ultimately, also with sales. To your point, Steve, that buyers are looking for lower footprints because they have to report lower footprints to their buyers. So they're looking for lower footprints on the supply side. And it's key. I would maybe just stress the challenge we face right now is getting LCA both actionable and accessible to the wide, a huge share of the economy. colleague and friend who's a professor now at UC Berkeley, he was working with Amazon for a number of years, recently found out that less than half of 1% of companies who've reported to CDP their carbon footprint even have a plan for how to reduce that footprint. Less than half of 1%. And as you both know, as you all know, that is a lot of more companies that don't yet know their footprint. So we have to make it feasible for companies to quickly understand their impacts, and we have to make that something that doesn't use up all their bandwidth, so they have bandwidth left over and ready to take these actions that you're talking about, John.
That, if I may, just real quick, that it's such a great point, Greg, because it's honestly where I've learned a lot at the association level. Prior to that, my job was really to look at the 3 or 4, maybe 5 competitors and see where they're at. And it became more of a group thing. So you're just worried about maybe the group or 2 ahead of you and maybe 1 or 2 behind you in terms of, say, revenue and sustainability, strategy and what they've done. But there were another 200 companies that now that I'm at the association level that I'm thinking through and, okay, where are they at? And what can we do to, work as an industry to make that happen as far as accessibility and working together? Because those are the people that are selling on Amazon, Wayfair, they're selling to clients as well. So it's definitely an issue that we have to think through. And again, I think together we can, but we need to work together on that one.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at such a breadth of companies, so many of them with different sustainability strategies, what are the key activities that you do from the industry association point of view to help them in facing those challenges?
Yeah, so this is where honestly why I was interested in becoming an employee of the association. I'd felt for years that we were competing in very specific areas that were more or less self-serving, and everyone can say what they want, but the mindset was, hey, if I'm really good at removing toxic chemicals, I'm going to talk about that with clients. If I'm good at climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So now what I'm noticing, number one, is, the data side of things has to be collected at an industry level for consistency's sake, for cost savings, and to help those smaller businesses. I think John was the one who pointed out, that don't have the resources to do so on their own. We're not going to get anywhere as a society if we're trying to get $15,000, $20,000 EPDs out the door for every single product. I mean, just anyone can do the math, just search office chairs and look at how many there are and multiply by 10 or 15,000. So that's number one, is how can we work together, get a calculator, work with people to do that, and then collect that data. So that kind of calculator and data mindset are the first things. The other one, maybe the third one, if we say data calculator, and then the third one is standardization practices. Again, PCRs are good, or product category rules are great. They kind of start to scope that, but I think we really need to be even more specific on what kind of information is used and how it's used within a calculator. So again, this gets us back to why we're all here today, and how I got to meet Greg. And by the way, I mean, Greg and Earthster came up from an association member, which was more of a mid-level member. By that I mean they weren't a large member with all kinds of resources. They were saying, we're looking for something here. So anyway, those are the consistencies that we're after. So people, getting back to John's food label conversation, which everyone wants in the world of architects, designers, clients, we need to have the rules of engagement there so that sodium number can be clear, whether it's one chair or another.
Yeah, maybe I'll just follow on what Steve said. So to give a little background on how I view it, the industry association here, and industry associations are different in every area, what their role is and how they play. But and that's important to understand. But I'll use the furniture industry as an example. The industry association collects market data. So everyone reports in anonymously what they sell in each market. So as company A, I can go and look at Philadelphia and know what my market share is, or I can look at Los Angeles and see what my market share is. I can't see all the competitive information, but I can then take action based on what I see. And that's been going on for years. So then I moved to, Steve didn't mention it, but what happened in the furniture industry is they sell to every customer in the world, governments, small companies, big companies, global companies, you name it, local companies. And they all had different requirements around sustainability when it first came out. You know, they said, we want to know that we're dealing with sustainable companies. So they would all come out with questionnaires and different frameworks, et cetera. And the manufacturers are going crazy trying to comply with all this. So they leveraged the industry association to create a certification called Level that brought in inputs of all the different companies, stakeholders like customers, architects and designers, and created a framework that I would say is a little bit general, but it's a framework for the industry that is a level 1, 2, or 3, 3 being the most sustainable, 1 maybe the least sustainable. And that worked for 5 to 10 years, but it was a great example of collaboration that allowed them to answer to customers, and customers who don't have the time to get into the detail were able to use that. Now, fast forward to where we are today. The SEC in the next month or two is going to come out with requirements around public company reporting that will filter into every third-party supplier, but it's going to take time. But it's a great opportunity. We know, Steve mentioned it, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, that's going to be the big elements. And LCAs that provide, let's call it an embodied carbon number, whether it's the potato chip label or not, that's going to be a huge area of opportunity going forward. But if we rely on regulation, it'll take too long. If you rely on individual companies, you won't get standardized approaches. An association is a great way to do it. And tools like Earthster help to enable that. So to me, that's kind of the holy grail, is how do you get that all brought together in one way that then, as we said earlier, lets us take action to actually make a difference around climate change and around toxicity and around material usage. So, I mean, I think that's where we're headed, and that's what the industry association tries to do. And that's an opportunity, I think, more broadly.
Yep. You know, John and Steve, I'd like to hear your thoughts for a moment on that challenge you mentioned, John, of first, the furniture industry is getting deluged by all sorts of non-standardized questionnaires to assess your sustainability. Now you turn and you look upstream, and you need data, of course, from your supply chains. And you've kind of got several problems there that seem like they're worth solving, again, with the association's leadership. One is that no single company has much leverage with a supplier. And the second is that all companies asking for something different is really going to turn off and maybe discourage your suppliers. So how have you seen associations tackle that issue of collecting the data piece?
Yeah. Steve, maybe I'll just jump in and then turn it over to you if you don't mind. Yeah, Greg, that would drive me crazy. You know, it was frustrating as a finance person to try to gather this data because, you know, in our industry, let's just say 70 to 80%, maybe more of the suppliers are common. It's what people do with them, how they try to, but here I have a team who, let's say it's a purchasing team or a product team or a design team, who you want them developing great products. You want them out there working with clients, finding solutions, and they're spending time trying to work with the supplier in Iowa to try and figure out what the materiality of their products are. It's just so inefficient, and it's really not necessarily a competitive differentiator in and of itself. So it's just not where you want to be spending your time. So the ability to go to an association and now, you know, in fairness, associations have limitations as well. They only have a certain amount of funding and a certain amount of expertise, and they have to answer to the companies that provide their funding. So there's definitely limitations, but an association is a great place to find those opportunities for efficiencies that aren't big competitive differentiators, and to allow it to be leveraged across the entire member base. And again, I'll use, not to keep using Earthster, but finding tools that they can bring to the industry that they can use that bring that data to them in an effective way or allow them to do scenario planning is a huge opportunity that finance people like me won't be frustrated by. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
No, I mean, you've covered most of it. I think that, you know, first of all, I mean, it does drive everyone nuts, Greg. I mean, in terms of the frustration around what I'll say is the multiple questions. So, I mean, just, you know, really quick math. Let's just say there's 100 parts to a task chair, which is not uncommon, you know, when you think of the nuts and bolts, things like that. Now there's whatever, 100 chairs. Now I have all these questions I'm asking these suppliers. I mean, the numbers, I'm not going to go through all the math, but we figured it out. I mean, the number of questions, the variations. So my supply chain, and even to John's point, we have both suppliers of materials and component suppliers that are shared by multiple people. And they'll tell you that they spend hours and hours answering questions to the manufacturer. The manufacturer is spending hours and hours, and that's like per week, by the way. That's not just over the course of a month or something, to send to clients. And again, it's all just speaking of a slightly different language, but it's where most of the time is spent in sustainability departments, in supply chains that are asking for, or are being told by their sustainability person to get this information. And it dilutes the message, number one. I mean, it dilutes the message, completely inefficient. So yeah, that's where we're going to come in, and we're working on it as we speak, with a consolidated data collection tool to start asking the questions, literally speaking the same language with the same information, so that it's collected in a more efficient way, and then it can be used. It's going to hopefully drive both consistency and, that's actually another area. I do have to tell this real quick story, because this is what you find out the more you work at this. When you ask a question to a supplier, depending on who it is, of course, it can completely depend. You can get two different answers depending on who you ask. And the classic example is, if the best you can do is find out that the axle of a caster, that you're rolling around on, and it's probably made overseas, and you ask if there's any hexavalent chrome, this is a real example, and if you ask the salesperson and that's the best you do, you'll probably hear, no, there's no hexavalent chrome. If you go a little deeper, because you know the right people, or maybe you visited, or maybe your supply chain person had visited, they'll be, oh yeah, there's hexavalent chrome in that. It in two different, again, I don't even think it's meant to be that way. It's just, the best information they have available. So we've found it to be that case where we're getting conflicting information, and that's obviously something we want to fix. So those are the kind of things that we think that can be done at a industry level that will honestly help everyone, kind of raise all boats, right? And and then let them compete on design, quality, customer service, all the things they should be competing on, but not sustainability data collection.
So make the data collection the level playing field, so that they can compete on what they actually do about sustainability.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, again, I can go through even my larger companies that are, relatively speaking, well-staffed. They'll still say they need more staff, by the way, but if they, it's all relative. And they're saying the same thing. We would rather work on actually making things more sustainable, not just data collection or trying to figure out that, did I get the sales answer or did I get the technical answer on this chemistry or this, carbon footprint type mindset.
And you've mentioned the overlap in these supply chains within an industry, but I'm quite certain that there's some overlap with other industries as well. So do you think that these challenges are something that industries should solve on their own, so each industry independently, or should there be common causes, and if so, which ones?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I just had a conversation about 2 weeks ago with, I'll call it my counterpart in the automotive industry. So, I'm out of the state of Michigan. On one side of the state, you have a lot of furniture manufacturers. On the other side of the state is automotive. And in the automotive supply chain, as you can all imagine, really does dictate a lot of plastics in particular. A lot of the furniture manufacturers will do their best to use a plastic that's already been developed or in production by automotive because of this economies of scale and the cost. So we're talking, and that's something that we definitely think we could work together on to both collect information and even move the needle at a Dow, DuPont, or one of the manufacturers of that plastic, that raw material. I think there's countless opportunities that way. I mean, that's the problem. You always have to focus on what you need. I just this yesterday connected with the Retailers Association. Same mindset. What are the retailers after? What are they looking for? And again, can we move in the same direction or ask the same questions? So yeah, a lot of opportunity that way.
Yeah, let me jump in and give you a little background. I mentioned earlier that I was SASB certified, so that's the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board, which is now the ISSB. But let me use that as a great example of why I think that it is relevant across multiple industries. So the way that the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board works is they take a very common framework of elements of a long list of metrics and measurements that they think are relevant for all of the elements around ESG. And then they've divided it into 77 different industries, where each industry then has a committee that evaluates what's relevant and important and material for that particular industry. So to me, what we're talking about when we talk about this being relevant for other industries, other associations, is that framework, that standardization of terminology, that framework that everyone can align around and recognize. And then there will always have to be tailoring to each industry, which has its own differentiations, but all around this common standardized framework. And to me, I think that's the long-term objective, or maybe short-term objective, is how do you get to that point? And that's some of the work that I know Steve is doing in industry and others, and that I'm trying to do at a broader level, is how do you create the right framework? How do you leverage companies externally that are credible and have these tools that you can bring in to use, so you can create this standardization, recognizing that everybody, a bank has a different industry than a manufacturer, which is different than a software provider. But they all have common frameworks that they can use. They all want to be able to leverage the knowledge that comes from a credible, reliable source. And I think that's the huge opportunity we have around LCAs, which I think are really one of the most impactful opportunities that companies have.
Excellent. Let's explore now a different angle. LCA traditionally has been a tool that's been aimed at has been used rather by big companies than SMEs. And we've talked about calling the suppliers very often being SMEs. So do you experience this to still be the same, or has it changed? And if so, what can or should be done to widen the opportunities for those small and medium enterprises to capitalize LCA?
Steve, you want to take that? Or?
Yeah, I'll take that. I'll start. I'm just trying to think through. I mean, in LCA, again, I mean, going back to what I mentioned earlier about the check the box activity, I think the good news is we're moving beyond that. I think, the only way a small and medium-sized company can really benefit from LCA work is through a call it industry-wide calculator to help them move through that process quickly. Again, time is of the essence. They're only going to have so much time, but once that is in place, and to be fair, I mean, there are some small medium-sized companies that for strategic reasons, maybe it's marketing, maybe it is internal sustainability reasons, have spent the time to do LCAs. And but either way, I mean, for the majority of them, I think once they do, it is going to be what it's used for. I mean, it's that idea that they can quickly find those hot spots and start looking at changes that can be made at a supplier level. Again, for our work in our industry, it is the supplier level. There's not a lot of, call it, in energy intensive activities that take place at the manufacturing level. I mean, there's painting, there's some washing of metal and things like that, and then drying of it, and there's heat involved. But for the most part, I think these companies, if they can start to see the difference between one supplier of steel and another, or aluminum versus steel, or all the usual things that anyone who's done LCA work has seen, that's where I think they can start making these incremental changes. Again, and that's the beauty of it. If we get this done in such a streamlined manner, again, we'll use John's, we didn't intend to do this, but we'll use John's potato chip bag, where, now at the supplier level, you start to see, okay, this is how I can lower my sodium, and pick it out that way. The great thing about a small company and a medium-sized company is they're generally willing to explore a little bit more, to turn on it, quickly. They don't necessarily have nearly the inertia that larger companies have, so they're willing to invest in, quicker on those new supply chains.
Yeah, and I second that. I mean, the study that we were working on, I mean, this industry uses an example. I mean, there's there's 100 members, let's just say, and on those, there's 5 of them that are over $1 billion, and then there's probably 80 of them that are 100 million or less. And as Steve said, there's a broad spectrum. The large ones generally are working on it, but even then they have LCAs for only select products, not all of their products. You know, their actionable component is very difficult. The cost is high, and some of the small ones have key products that they've done it on. But in general, there's just a lack of knowledge all across that. And I do think that the small companies can make a big difference, but having someone who can provide that framework that they can leverage and then have to act on, just like the market share example I gave earlier. You want to make sure that you're respecting the competitive nature of every company, but you also want, as an industry, want to enable progress and commonalities and efficiencies and effectiveness that let you respond to stakeholders that are really pushing you. Because, you know, in many cases, what's really driving it is customers demanding it and responding to customers and responding to that. Obviously, I think Steve said it, there's a lot of, luckily, you know, altruism in organizations where they actually want to make progress around sustainability, and that helps, but it's a pretty broad spectrum out there, as you might imagine. So having one common approach for an industry that lays out a framework with ground rules that lets small companies really compete on a level playing field, which I think everyone is comfortable with that in general.
And uncertainty breeds inefficiency. So if we can eliminate the unnecessary uncertainty, then
absolutely.
Definitely. I know also that Greg has worked and has also opinions about the accessibility of life cycle assessment in different types of companies and people. Do you want to comment a bit on that, Greg?
Well, I guess I'll just share that it kind of connects to the comment I made earlier. We have to find a way to engage 100 times more companies in this and people in this ultimately. And that means in part that the tool has to be more inviting. It has to, tools and methods have to be more inviting to a broader range of people and accessible, as you say, Daniel, that you don't need a chemical engineering background to feel comfortable and intuitive, understanding your life cycle and getting insights from that model and improving it.
Thank you, Greg. And I have one last question. Looking at the clock, more as an outreach and imagining the brightest future. What is one of the most hopeful signs or trends or changes that you see happening or coming quickly in relationship to life cycle sustainability?
You want to go first, John, or you want me to go?
Sure. I'll jump in. You know, I have a particular passion on the circular economy, for example, and I'm excited. It's amazing to me how awareness has changed so dramatically in the last few years around the circular economy, and it connects to, you know, the awareness of resources, the need to have things like embodied carbon awareness that lets you know how it flows through the whole cycle. And it's been a really a dramatic increase in my view. It's still going way too slow in my view. But if I think of 10 years ago or 5 years ago, if I'd asked someone what they thought about the effectiveness of the circular economy, they would say, "What's the circular economy?" There's a much deeper understanding, but there's huge barriers. And I'll maybe get back to the last time I'll talk about the potato chip bag. You know, if it moves too slowly. I mean, in the 60s is when they required companies to report ingredients on food. And it wasn't until 1990 before they mandated that you have these labels. And now here we are, 30 years later. That's just too slow. And so when I think about the hopeful signs, is the pace is dramatically accelerating. Mm-hmm. There's so many more companies. The complexity is there's so many more companies and organizations trying to help figure this out. The opportunity is there's so many companies out there willing to help you to figure it out. And so I'm really excited about so many people that are passionate about it and diving right in. And I really think we're headed in the right direction. Steve, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, again, 20 years doing this type of work, in the last 3 or 4 years have been a dramatic shift in terms of people getting together. So I'm involved, on an association level. I'm involved with a group called Mindful Materials that's bringing people together. In both cases, I think we're picking up the baton that maybe kickstarted this whole thing 20 years ago was groups like LEED and others that were defining what green building is. I think then it became more of a competitive landscape. I think again, the last 4 or 5 years, people started to say, okay, this isn't working if we're going to move and accelerate like John's suggesting. And so I've had people call me up and say, and these are people who used to compete, and it was competing on sustainability. We can call it what it is. And now they're calling me up saying, how do we work together? This isn't going well if we work separately. So I'm extremely hopeful. I think that we're finally hitting that piece where people are realizing that working together is the only way this is going to happen. And, that's what we needed. Again, I don't think it was necessarily intentional. They weren't working together. I just think it was one of those things that, as a company, you're just trying to do your best. But yeah, I'm seeing a completely different shift in terms of how people are approaching this.
Thank you very much. And that is a great and positive note to finish the event. And thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Greg. This has been excellent. And I want to thank also our participants. Those who are watching now and those who will get the video later. And for those watching, if you want to continue, many of you subscribe to repeated events and tend to ask about what's coming up. There's an Earthster training coming up on April 19th. And you will get additional details through email, but you can learn more about how to use Earthster to understand your environmental impacts. Until then, let's keep getting closer to sustainability. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.